many more. So with this information on me, I wanted to gain a little bit of insight on you guys. Would you mind typing into the chat box what types of federal grants you are writing or are interested in pursuing? And if you could enter the department name, and if you know specifically like the funding opportunity name, or, you know, it doesn't have to be the formal funding opportunity, but just an idea of what you're interested in applying for. And of course, if there's nothing you're interested in, that's, you know, no federal grants right now, you're just looking for general information, that's fine too. But this will kind of help me gauge what you, a little bit better, what you guys are looking for. And Michelle is going to help me tally that up. So I'll give you guys a minute to do that. And I'll tell you a little bit about Assel Grant Services while you're doing that. So we have a staff of 15. 12 of us are professional, or are grant professionals, and 9 of us 12 are grant professional certified. We have a lot of federal grant experience. We help clients do everything from writing, reviewing, submitting, designing complex projects, implementing them, reporting on them. And we work for a variety of agencies, including nonprofits, institutes of higher ed, school districts, healthcare systems, behavioral health centers. And our clients really range from, oh, I apologize. Our clients really range from a broad mix of, they have large federal grant portfolios, and some are brand new to applying for federal grants. Okay, so I'd like to see what responses we have here.
Tracey, it looks like we have the USDA, Department of Education, Department of Parks, CNCS, SBA Community Navigator, New York State Department of Education, Health and Human Services, SAMHSA, Department of Justice, NIMH, ACL. I'm just going to say all federal grants.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm hearing some Department of Parks, like I hadn't thought about that one, but I'm hearing a lot that will kind of, the things that we are going to talk about in this presentation will touch on this. So I think that we're really going to we're going to explore in depth the how-tos, and I'm going to break this up into 3 chunks, kind of based on what Allison and Michelle had told me. And the 3 chunks really are how to examine some of the major trends in federal funding, and then researching and finding those appropriate grant opportunities. That's kind of one chunk. The second section is going to talk about reading RFP guidelines and requirements, and then pulling out of those requirements, really the focus on evidence-based requirements. And then the third piece is going to talk about federal planning approaches and how you go about that. So if you're like me, I miss the in-person stuff, including my in-person chapter meetings. I invite you at any time to raise your hand. Michelle's going to help monitor the chat for me. Type in any questions, and she can stop me at appropriate points and we can integrate those questions. I love the interaction idea because I believe we're all experts, and I learn so much when I do these presentations, and I love for everyone to share. I'll of course share my federal experiences, but as I just saw in this long list, you all have a lot of experience too. So I'd love to hear your successes and challenges. Okay, learning objectives for today. I already covered the chunks that I'm going to go over, so I won't read these again. But again, just the trends, the research, the RFP guidelines, and planning approaches. All of our trainings, all of our trainings in general that we do as a company, Assel Grant Services, are aligned with the GPC competencies. So each of the presentation components here today is also aligned with the competencies. And here on this slide, you can see those. All of our trainings have been approved for continuing education credit through GPC. So if you're tracking this on your certification maintenance manual, or whatever they call that, the CMP, you can get 1 credit for this presentation. Okay, so let's go to our first chunk here. Let's talk high level on trends in federal funding. So kind of how the process works a little bit overall. Starting in July, At the federal level, the Office of Management and Budget gives guidance to federal agencies about funding levels and priorities. And then the office really works from there within these guidelines to structure a budget. The president submits his budget request to Congress on or about the first Monday in February. And I want to say, if there's, as you guys know, if there's changes in parties, there can be dramatically different or completely opposite budgets. And I'll get to I'll say a little bit about this in a minute. From there, the proposed budget enters the legislative process, and the House and Senate then develop their own budget resolutions to set the spending levels. And then the House and Senate Appropriations Committees hold hearings to examine the budget request and the needs of federal spending programs. The House and Senate then go and produce their appropriation bills to fund the federal government. And then these bills are amended as needed and approved by the committees and then sent to the full floor, where they can get additional amendments before being passed. Most bills don't match exactly between the Senate and House, and then the two chambers have to go through the negotiation process to find a middle ground. And then they can pass the reconciliation and the president can sign it or veto it. So if this process, like this year, happened this year, does not take place before October 1st, a continuing resolution is required or the federal government is shut down. So right now we're experiencing that continuing resolution until December 3rd. And then I think as of what I read recently, they're expecting it to be passed by December 3rd. So a minute ago, I mentioned that there can be major differences with changes in the parties. I recently went to a training and a federal grants agency presented, and they showed some pretty dramatic differences in the grants landscape from the previous administration to the current administration. One of the departments they focused on was Department of Ed, and then including some other education grants through, like, I think Department of Energy had one, and there were a couple other agencies there. And the proposed budget now represents like almost over an 8%, which is a big difference from fiscal year 21 levels. So it has the proposed 2022 has a much more robust landscape with increased funding for the Department of Ed. Department of Commerce was another one that increased, Health and Human Services, and Department of Agriculture, along with some other major departments. I also want to add that major money is coming down to address mental health, violence, and substance abuse. There's a lot coming through SAMHSA, but it's certainly not all SAMHSA. We're seeing it through the Department of Justice, Health and Human Services, CDC, and Department of Ed. School shootings and suicide and opioid epidemic are some of the other hot topics that our grants are working to address, that we're seeing grants coming down for. And then in addition to that, we're also seeing some new investments as a result of the CARES Act, which was passed in March of 2020, and now the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, that was passed on March 11th, I believe, of this year. And this has a primary focus. It's a $1.9 trillion bill, I believe, with a primary focus on combating COVID-19, including the public health and economic impacts the U.S. has been experiencing. So this bill had significant investments in a couple of areas, including direct financial assistance, those stimulus checks, and tax credits, and the payroll protection, assistance to individuals and families, such as like your SNAP program, housing programs such as homelessness assistance and emergency rental. And then other programs that saw increases were also Veterans Affairs, family violence prevention, child abuse prevention and treatment state grants, and then pandemic emergency assistance, family planning, and others. Okay, so those are kind of high level, some of the trends in federal funding. Let's talk now about researching. Have you guys been to grants.gov lately? So I don't know if you're seeing the grants.gov overall has a much more robust site. There are more and more departments that are now fully utilizing the website. And notably, I've seen, and I do a lot of work in it. So Department of Health and Human Services, they have developed their own very, I would say, very robust site. And this has also now been linked to grants.gov. Also in grants.gov, they now allow for the creation of a username and password so you can search and save your searches. So if you were going out to grants.gov and searching for the same terms over and over, you can save your search and then run it with the same terms at another time, and it'll keep pulling it up. So you don't have to keep recreating the search each time. You can download what you've searched. You can export it, I think, into a CSV first, and then you can go to like an Excel. You can add columns, you can move things around, and you can start to rank or order your search based on, you know, what kind of you're looking for in your funding opportunities. We also offer a webinar on this topic. It's called Federal Find and Fit, and it goes through some of the specifics of this type of research, and it also talks more in depth about grants.gov. It's part of a larger training series that we deliver, and the training series is all on federal grants, and it includes other areas. In addition to research, it also includes evidence-based programming and budgeting and more. That's on our website. I'll put that, I'll show you that on my last slide at the end if you're interested in deeper research or other topics. Another feature of grants.gov is it allows you to email opportunities to members of your staff. And then I believe they have now or are getting a new mobile app. I have not looked into that, but I know it was coming or is here now. So if you haven't went to grants.gov, I would encourage you to go out there and look at some of the opportunities and sign up to get the e-blast so that you can be reading through these opportunities daily. I like to select the agencies I'm most interested in. Otherwise, it can be overwhelming. And the website also has a wealth of other things like webinars, video clips, blogs, that sort of thing. Okay, so that was trends and kind of research. Let's move into reading an RFP and its guidelines. So how to read an RFP. Downloading and opening an RFP, request for proposal. So downloading and opening a request for proposal can be overwhelming. It's not uncommon for some RFPs to be 50+ pages long. I still have projects where I see the RFP is over 100 pages long. Now, some departments have started to create or have created a policy guideline or, proposal and policies guidelines. These include NSF has one, Department of Education, some departments at Health and Human Services, and Department of Justice. So what this means is when the agencies have these proposal guidelines to follow, and then when an RFP comes out, that is specific to the funding opportunity. So as a grant writer, you have two pieces of material to now review, the policy guidelines and the funding opportunity. Now, this can be beneficial if you're someone like me and you apply a lot to the Department of Health and Human Services, or you do a lot of National Science Foundation grants. You get to know that policy guideline, and you kind of know what the department's requirements and their formatting and those types of things are. And you can have those, after doing them over and over again, you start to memorize them. For someone who does not apply a lot, if you're all over the board and you kind of apply to all different agencies, it can become cumbersome because some of these policy guidelines, they're long. Like the National Science Foundation, theirs is the Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide, and it's over 180 pages long. So it just depends on, how frequently you're using these. So whether the RFP is short or long, one of the most difficult things for me personally is funders oftentimes will put, and you guys know this, they will put instructions and guidelines, and I see it happening a lot in federal, will put instructions and guidelines all over the RFP. So one of the most complex challenges is really digging through a long RFP to pull out every single spot I need requirements. I really invest a lot of time on the front end, reading through the RFP and highlighting, writing down my notes, flagging pages, and looking for things like, what are the key dates? Not just the deadline of the application, but webinars, any dates that are on there. Are letters of interest required, and when are those due? How many pages is it? There's a huge difference between writing a 20-page grant or a 6-page research grant. Or maybe you have an application that's a total of 75 pages, which includes significant attachments. Those are all very different types of grants. So it's very important to know how much needs to actually be written, because some of those attachments aren't your standard attachment like a resume. It can be something that requires a lot of content to be generated. I'm also looking at who can apply. So this is typically more specific than foundation grants. They will typically list out, they will have a much more specific listing. Does the funding require a match? What does it pay for? So some federal grants are implementation grants, and recipients are expected to implement implement an evidence-based program, or they're planning an implementation grant. So they have to have a planning phase and then the implementation phase. Some are research grants in which you're trying to create the next step in the evidence-based pathway. So it's important to know what the grant is paying for. What data am I going to need to report on? So to justify programs, federal agencies will develop shared data points that you have to collect. And this allows them to provide a report to Congress at the end on what was the impact of the awards that came out of this funding opportunity. In addition, many grants will expect you to define your need in a particular way. So I don't know if you guys have ever done this. It's federal, but they're administered by the state. The 21st Century grants, they require you to pull information on free and reduced priced lunch rates. Other grants may require percentages on federal poverty levels. I've done grants that require information on mental health professional shortage areas. I had to think of the acronym, or medically underserved areas. So it's important to know what data they're wanting. And some will even put when the data, how recent it needs to be. A huge factor is partnerships. Are there required partnerships? Does your program need to work with someone else in order to meet the required activities? Or some will say, a partnership is required with your local law enforcement. And that can be a deal breaker, obviously, for a grant. Also, does it require an external evaluator? Does the evaluator have to be external, or can it be an internal one? And then lastly, evidence-based practices. So our evidence-based practices, oh gosh, I apologize. Okay, so evidence-based practices, and I saved this one for last because this is one of the areas that was identified that your group was interested in going a little bit more into. So in general, an RFP may ask, what is the evidence level of your program, model, or services? It may ask, is there research or other evidence demonstrating this program can be successful when it's implemented in accordance with the model on which it's based? And then what documentation do you have of your evidence-based or evidence-formed approach? In order to answer these questions, it's important that we start with a common definition base. I struggle with this because funders often are not clear. They use the phrases research-based and evidence-based almost interchangeably, and they are two very different things. Research-based simply means there are theories behind the activities, but they aren't always proven true. And then the whole idea of proven true is tricky because it's to what degree is it proven true? And then evidence-based really means there's efficacy to back it up. And efficacy means the ability to consistently produce a desired result by recreating the same actions. The confusing part here is that typically an evidence-based program is a set of activities developed from scientific evidence, and using research has been found effective based upon evaluation. So evidence-based programs are research-based, but research-based programs may not be evidence-based. This means if a funder is asking for evidence-based programming and your project is research-based, you want to be very careful in how you're describing your program, and you want to know what the funder is looking for. Most evidence-based program activities and programs have had their research published, and this research is typically published in a peer-reviewed journal. And peer review is the process of subjecting the research to the review of other experts in the field, typically before it's published. And then in academic publishing, peer review assesses the quality of the research and articles submitted for publication. The review helps then validate the research, and it establishes a method by which it can be evaluated. So if you're looking for research articles from publications which use this process, some of the good journals are the Journal of American Medical Association. In education, there's the Journal of Higher Education, the Journal of Educational Psychology, or the American Educational Research Journal. If you don't know what the journals are for your field, you can start like I did, and you can just type in your sector or your service and put journal behind it. So you could type in Human Services Journal, Social Services Journal. And how Google does it is it will actually filter or bring to the top those journal articles. So you don't even necessarily have to weed through your search to find which ones are journals. Okay, I've covered a lot. I feel like, Michelle, I should probably pause and ask Michelle if you're seeing any questions.
Sorry, I was on mute. The only question that you haven't already addressed, Tracey, is someone wants to know if you are aware of programs that serve immigrant or refugee populations.
I'm assuming that question is at the federal level. And I don't know of any off the top of my head, but I would be shocked if there's not. So what I would recommend is going to grants.gov and searching by keyword. Another thing is grants.gov is doing the departments that are using grants.gov are doing a better job. Some of them are doing a better job at forecasting grant opportunities. So look at the boxes you click and make sure you have forecasted opportunities looked at, because that will allow you to see what's upcoming. And then I would include closed opportunities or archived, because that way you can see past grants that have past funding opportunities that have come out. And a lot of times some of them can be annual opportunities. So if you see one that might match immigrant and refugee population, look at it and see if it's coming out annually, because then you can project it for the next year.
Tracey, there are a couple of more questions that apply to the content you're discussing right now. The first is, do you suggest that the published research journals are used to demonstrate need or to replicate programming?
Okay, my hunch would be, I think maybe more of this will get addressed as we go down the slides, but my hunch is, like everything in your proposal, you want everything aligned, right? So you want your need, you want your target population, you want your proposed solution, your project design, you want your goals, outcomes, objectives, you want all of those to align. So, and evidence-based programming is going to fall within your program design. So my hunch would be that that research is going to reflect back to the need. It's definitely going to reflect back to your target population and then your program design, because you want to show, hey, this is our project. And this is how it aligns with the study, our target population, our need, you want to show that alignment. Okay.
Thank you, Tracey. Oh, I'm sorry. You have one more question.
Okay. Go ahead. I may hold it and keep going because it might be addressed, but go ahead.
Okay. If you are asked for evidence-based and only provide research, that would cost a loss of points, correct?
Depends on the funder, but I'm going to get to this in the let me move on. One of the examples Michelle and Allison shared with me was the Department of Ed. So they actually have an evidence-based form that's required with their proposal, and for that funder, absolutely you could potentially, but it depends on the specific funding opportunity. So let's move on, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. Okay, so let's talk about the levels of evidence-based. As I just mentioned, the Department of Ed has a specific evidence-based attachment required with some opportunities. So I'm going to talk about these levels of evidence from a perspective of that form. There's other levels that I do not have listed here. These are just like the top three, and these are also in the Department of Ed form. So that's how I've kind of aligned the discussion. The first, strong evidence. This is the highest level of evidence. And as you go down, you decrease in statistical significance. Strong evidence is well-supported research, like 2 or more randomized controlled outcome studies, comparing target treatment to an appropriate alternative and showing significant advantage to the target treatment. So this means people didn't pick the services which they received. It was random, and it compares the targeted intervention to whatever practices you're currently doing or what the gold standard is for the field. And then ideally, those who are getting the gold standard hopefully have better results than the current practices that are going on. The next level is moderate. This is supported research which has been shown to produce positive outcomes, but it may include non-randomized designs with some form of control group, which simply may mean one group gets no treatment. And then the third level, as defined by the Department of Education, is promising evidence. It's still considered promising acceptable treatment, but includes interventions that actually don't have any research behind it. If you start trying to find research for something you're working with a client and they've been doing this program for 10 years and you keep asking program people and they tell you, well, nobody's really ever published research on this. We just know it works. We have great outcomes. So that is an example of general acceptance. Perhaps the clinical literature isn't talked about, or, perhaps it's clinical literature that shows you have these positive outcomes, but there's no formal study. This typically, on this Department of Education form that I will show you next, this typically will not earn full points by going with this promising evidence. But again, it's based on the funding opportunity. I am increasingly seeing, and as a company, I would say we are increasingly seeing these types of questions in federal grants. And then us, as the grant professionals, have to explain the similarities or differences in the original or approved population for the intervention. And then one of the biggest things we're frequently asked is, okay, well, where do I find these paragons of evidence? There's a number of resources out there. Department of Education focuses on What Works Clearinghouse for Education. Another resource is the Evidence-Based Practices Resource Center for Substance Abuse and Mental Health. This replaces the National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices, which was around for a while. And then Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development, and that's a pretty comprehensive registry of scientifically proven interventions for healthy youth development. I used to work internally as a grant professional at Big Brothers Big Sisters, and that's one that we relied on a lot. Okay, so let's talk about this Department of Education form. So on this slide is an example of this form. You can see the first thing you need to select is the level of evidence. And then it's important to know these levels of evidence, whether it's this form or a different agency, these will be defined in the RFP. So you want to read this and really understand and know it, so you know which is the appropriate category to select. And then you will fill in this chart for each study you're using to meet the evidence standards. And then under citation, you're going to provide the full citation of the research. And then for What Works, for Department of Ed, they focus on What Works Clearinghouse, that database. So if your research comes out of the What Works Clearinghouse, you want to state it in here. For this specific one, it was not in here, but you want to include the information on What Works Clearinghouse if it's in there, and a link to it, or some grants you can include it as an attachment. In the relevant findings, you should describe your project component included in this. You should describe the project component that's included in both the study and your project. The relevant outcome in both your study and your project. Again, you're showing that alignment. And then third, the study recommendations supporting a favorable relationship between the project component and the outcome. In the overlap of population and settings, you want to explain how the population and or setting in your project is similar to the study. Okay, so I've said that DOE focuses heavily on the What Works Clearinghouse and encourages applicants to use that database. However, there may be projects that applicants want to include, but they don't have research in the What Works Clearinghouse. And in that case, depending on the evidence-based requirements that are defined in the funding opportunity, you may want to review your research and either ensure that it meets What Works Clearinghouse, or work with an expert evaluator to kind of look at the research and see if it meets the requirements of What Works Clearinghouse, or perhaps that funding opportunity does not require that. So you can state, you can use your different research. And my colleague Michelle has done a lot of writing for Department of Ed and has seen maybe a little bit of a shift. I'm hesitant to say that because I don't know if it's a shift overall, but we have seen some that aren't requiring What Works Clearinghouse. So they just want to see your research, whether it comes from there or not. And it's not necessarily losing points. So most of the human service organizations that we work with fall into this promising evidence, or actually may even fall into a category that comes before the promising evidence, which is pre-preliminary. And this means that they have general acceptance, but no literature review. For hardcore funders or hardcore evidence-based funders, this might not be enough. And as the grant professional, you will then have to dig to find the research to support your project activities. Okay, so let's talk about how then we would describe these levels of evidence in your proposal. So there's many factors that determine how you'll describe your grant proposal. One of the biggest things people often ask is how to cite your research. Online applications don't allow for footnotes or often a reference or works cited page. And for these, I'll typically put in parentheses the author, year of publication, name of article, and name of journal. This really gives the reader the key data points: who, what, when, where. But like DOE, they might require a full form. So in that case, you would complete that, but you want to make sure your narrative aligns as well. If an applicant has a program that's a lower level of evidence, like I just talked about pre-preliminary, you can use a variety of different strategies, and you obviously want to follow what the RFP says. But one of the things I've seen work really well with funders is, or reviewers, is for these types of programs, creating a chart that it shows how your program aligns with the evidence, with the research based, or whatever. And you want to make sure your model, you explain which components of your model are delivered with 100% fidelity and which components may be deviations. And sometimes your deviation is based on your target population. What works for one population doesn't work for the next. So you would want to explain, hey, this is why we do a deviation on, this is why we offer these services at this time and not this time, because this works better for our group than it did in the, than the research shows, or something like that. Okay. So we've covered the trends, research, and reading an RFP in the evidence-based requirements. Let's talk about the planning and approach for federal governments. In my opinion, this process, the level of detail is really what shies people away many times from federal grants. And as many of you know, because I've seen the list of what you're looking at or what you are writing in federal grants. The level of detail really that is required in federal grants takes a lot. So it starts with the funding opportunity. And you want to ensure that as you're reading the RFP, the guidelines and requirements, you're following this all the way through. It's implemented. These guidelines and requirements are implemented all the way through your planning, your proposal, and then obviously your project implementation. I frequently will tell people that if they aren't willing to track the need, the client demographics, outcomes, and the money spent in detail, in great detail, then federal grants simply aren't for them, or at least not right now. Best practice really has you ideally planning your project based on the previous year's RFP before the next one's even released. I talked about looking at forecasted grants and grants.gov. That's a great thing to look at, because ideally you need that full planning period. Many agencies will do a webinar on their funding opportunity, but oftentimes you'll find that that webinar won't be conducted until 2 weeks into the application. And most federal grants have a 4 to 8 week window. So if your webinar is at 2 weeks, I mean, that potentially could leave you 3 weeks, 4 weeks to write, potentially less. And good planning can make sure you're ready to do this. So my planning process, I begin by creating a timeline. With a submission deadline. I do it 1 week in advance of the actual deadline. No, this does not always work. I've submitted many federal grants within hours of the deadline. It is not fun and not recommended. As you guys know, most agencies recommend a 24 to 48 hour window. This allows for their system to catch technical errors, and you can bounce it back and change it. I've had this happen. I had it happen with a DOE innovation grant, and I was actually able to change it and get it back in time. So it's submission early is key. So I start my timeline by backing out with that internal deadline I've created. I make all attachments due 1 week before this internal deadline I've created. I make sure I separate out attachments from appendices. Attachments and appendices are not the same thing. Appendices often require well, maybe not necessarily new, but require the generation of content. And oftentimes you have to align it depending on what content is needed, it has to be aligned with a narrative. So it's important that you have these two separated out. I will look at the application questions and the appendices, and I will start creating my call agendas with my client based on these. I start with the biggest questions overall and go in and fill in the detail as I go. I schedule weekly meetings with the client, and I use a very targeted agenda to guide the meetings. I typically create my agenda right when the RFP comes out ahead of time. So I have call 1 agenda, call 2, I have all my agendas, and then I tweak it as I go. So as I get answers to questions, or we get stuck in a section, then I shift the other questions to the next call agenda and keep moving it along. I would say I invest a lot of time on the front end doing this timeline, establishing agendas and call questions so that I can get the information that I need to ideally hang up the phone with the client. And I try to allow myself at least a minimum of 30 minutes, ideally an hour. And if it's a complex grant, 1 to 2 hours of that time to immediately go into the narrative and start writing, or, the appendices, or working on the attachments, so that I can, I know what I have and where I need to move next. I also, I do want to say, I always recommend to grant professionals any type of professional development around running effective meetings. I've seen many resources. I've done a training myself, and I attended a training. I've seen lots of just resources, materials, and trainings on this topic of running effective meetings. And it's so crucial to crafting a good narrative and a quality proposal. We do offer training on effective meetings, but there are many resources out there. I encourage you to look at them. I personally like to start my meetings with the logic model. This helps me know where gaps might exist within the program. And then I might use that logic model as my first call agenda and then go from there. It also avoids, it helps me bring in the right people, so I can bring in the leadership team and bring everybody together to develop the project design. And then there's no surprises in the end, like, oh, no, our board didn't approve that for next year, or we're not hiring that position. So lastly, I'll say, can you write a federal grant? Yes, you can write a federal grant. The thing to take into consideration is that on average, you may spend 80 to 100 hours. So obviously that's a big factor. Do I have that time? I personally think writing federal grants are a learned skill. And just like any other funder, you can get to know what they want. Time, knowing that 80 to 100 hours, that might be a huge factor. And often that's when I see clients turning to a consultant because they just don't have adequate time. Or some will, I've seen some seek us out because they know, like, we do a lot of National Science Foundation grants, or we've done a lot of 21st century grants, or we've done AmeriCorps proposals. So they'll kind of look for a consultant who might have expertise in that particular area. If you want to apply for funding, the best place to start is by checking grants.gov, the department website, and looking at their priorities. The beauty of federal grants, to me, is their transparency and accountability, which makes it easy for us sometimes to find what we need if we want to apply. Okay, so now I've given you all of my big chunks, the trends research, reading the RFP, evidence-based, and then kind of like the overall of planning and writing. Does anyone have any questions?
There's one question in the chat. Going back to the evidence-based versus research-based sources. And the question is, would you use this style of evidence-based descriptions even if you are not required to submit the chart that was in the previous slide, the What Works Clearinghouse chart, the table? Is it a good tip for general practice as a federal grant writer to use that language?
So I would say, and whoever asked this question, can they unmute themselves? Yeah.
Sorry, I was muted. It was me, I admit.
Oh, great. Okay, awesome. Well, and I was just gonna say, like, I'll talk and then stop me if I'm wrong. Okay, so it depends on the funder, right? So it depends on the funder and the funding opportunity. So if you're pursuing another federal grant opportunity and they are what we would call like a hardcore evidence-based funder, and they're asking for input, tell us how your program aligns or what research is there to support your program, you may want to include that language. And you'll be able to tell this by reading the RFP. Look at the language in the RFP. Like, are they using the same technical terms around research that you might see in a different department's grant or a different funding? It might even be a different funding opportunity out of the same department, but are they using the same technical language? If it's like a foundation funder, oftentimes they're not as rigorous on the evaluation side. So putting that type of detail and technicalities around research into your proposal may not, they may not understand it. And then that can create gray areas. For those types of funders, I love the chart idea. Like, I've seen this done in a lot of 21st century grants or, school-based program, youth development programming, and they'll create a chart and it shows like the program components, the target population, the program components of their project, and then on the other side is in the other column is the research based, and it's actually like the wording, it shows the details of that research that aligns with the program, and then cited somewhere underneath the citation is actually underneath the table.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Great question.
Tracey, we have about 5 minutes left, just to give you an idea, and 3 questions in the chat.
Great.
The first is, how do you develop those call agendas? I'm unclear on what they contain.
Okay, so here's how I develop my call agendas. When it is a federal grant, I go through the sections of the application. So your needs section, your target population, your narrative, your outcomes and objectives, and sustainability. I go through those and I line it up with those sections. Oftentimes, so the call agenda number 1, oftentimes I will line that one up to program design. And that's where I mentioned starting with the logic model, because the program design is a big section of your application. The needs in the narrative, that may be the first section you're addressing in the target population, but the program design is really the biggest chunk. So oftentimes call agenda number 1, I am creating those questions out of what is written in the RFP around what they want to see in the project design. And then call agenda 2 may be needs and target population. And I'm deriving my questions from that, what they're wanting in the RFP. I typically do not, I used to, like in my early days, I would pull specific questions out of the RFP. I do not do that anymore. I try to use more probing questions, because in working with clients, it can be very easy to get yes, no responses, and you kind of got to dig and pull to get information out.
Thank you, Tracey. The next question is, what is the reality of success for local nonprofits that don't have a record of receiving federal grants?
I don't know what I would have to say, like in the industry, I don't know what the percentages are. I personally worked for a really small nonprofit in Southern Illinois that applied for their very first federal grant. And the key is the fit, right? Do you fit what that funding opportunity is trying to accomplish? Can you meet those goals and outcomes? are you set up to successfully manage a federal grant? And this tiny little agency with a budget of $400,000 at the time received a $300,000 federal grant from the Department of Health and Human Services. Their program aligned with exactly what they wanted, and we could show that we had, we had systems in place. Like, even though we weren't big, we had systems in place to show tracking and accountability. We had, the software, those types of things.
And were they able to manage it? Okay.
Yes. I stayed with them. I was with them for 7 years, and yes, they were.
Encouraging.
Along that same vein, the last question is, please discuss recommendations for a startup organization seeking funding, given that there is not a track record to show program success.
It depends on what department you're going for. I feel like all my answers to start with, it depends. It depends on what department you're going for. But one of the way I've gotten questions from clients, like on the management side, not just like the project activities, like you'll want to look at your specific funding opportunity for can we deliver on these project activities. But one of the other requirements is really like the financial tracking and reporting of it. And if you go to, there's often many departments require an attachment, and it's called a financial management questionnaire or something like that. I can get the official name. I encourage clients to sometimes go through that and see if they can answer those questions, if they have the systems in place to do what is required to answer yes to all those questions, or be able to track all that. That can kind of give you a framework of where you need to start.
Tracey, one last question that came in. You can write in grant evaluator, data manager, and other positions needed for new orgs and grant management, correct? Write them into the budget and other parts of the proposal, that is, correct?
It depends on the funding opportunity. They'll specify. That's why you want to check what do they allow funding for. You want to check that and see if they're allowing funding for those types of things. I will say I've seen many grant opportunities absolutely allow you to write a data manager in there. Some will even encourage it. Because they want to see that that data is going to be accurate, timely. They want to be able to say that. One other comment to the earlier question, I mentioned for an organization that isn't sure if they're ready, there are lots of tools out there on organizational readiness for federal grants. I feel like we as a company have one. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I would encourage you to just do a general Google search, because there's information out there about that.
Last call for questions.
Oh,
One more came through. I know that we're actually at 1 minute over.
it's okay. It's okay.
Okay.
It's a good question.
Information. Can you speak a bit about you're gonna like this, Tracey, maybe weeby, about the maybe weeby requirement in federal grants?
Oh, okay. So this is for if this is like an if applicable situation. So if your project is proposing to use a vendor or subcontractor or something like that, is that vendor a minority business enterprise, or that's what it's looking to address. There are many projects I have written that do not, that's not applicable. And in those cases, I've stated in an appropriate spot in the proposal. The application I'm specifically thinking of is pass-through federal funding that comes through city government, and in the appropriate spot of the application will state not applicable. There are no proposed vendors for this project. Now, if there is, you want to state, and it depends, because the funding opportunity will tell you where to put it, but obviously then you want to state who you're working with, and that they are minority business enterprise. And if you don't, if you're not working with that type of vendor, then you risk losing points for that.
I'll ask one more quick question. Have you been a federal grant reviewer, and do you recommend getting yourself on that path to increase your likelihood of success?
Yes, I have been a reviewer. It was the most interesting experience. This was like a long time ago. It was for the Department of Health and Human Services, and it was back in the day when they like flew you. I think I had to fly to Maryland, and they locked me in this, it was on an Air Force base or something, and they locked me in this space, and we just, it was a wonderful experience. We just reviewed applications the entire time. It was 4 days. I will tell you, I gained the most professionally in my writing through this experience. There are so many more opportunities now. And I'm actually doing a training on this because I've had people ask this question. So I'm doing a training on this next month, but there are many different opportunities now, and a lot of it is virtual. So the likelihood of being able to engage, you don't have to fly to this little bunker room in Maryland like I had to. I will tell you, at the time that I did it, and I don't believe it's changed, it's prepare yourself for labor intensive. My first day, I was very new to it, and I had kind of a like team member mentors come to me and say, okay, now be prepared to like work 10 hours, 10 or 12 hours today. It'll just take you a while to get acclimated to doing this. But what you gain out of that and how you learn to then write your own proposals and review other proposals is definitely something that I have not learned anywhere else. I've also served as a reviewer for a national organization that hires consultants to come in and just review federal proposals. And I've also done that as well. And I've done that virtually from home. That's a little bit less labor intensive because you can select, okay, I'd love to review 5 applications. And they'll give you the timing and everything, like, okay, this will be coming in June, and they'll let you know in March, hey, this is coming in June. It's just a wonderful experience. You learn how to match up a proposal to the scoring rubric.
Well, if there are no other questions, I just want to thank Tracey and Michelle so much for being here. I learned a lot. I hope everyone did. Well, I'm just thrilled that we had this. I took a ton of notes. I have pages of notes here. We will stay on for a few more minutes if people do want to just chat, continue our networking a little bit. I know it's hard to get these times. I am going to just mention, sorry, Nancy?
Yeah, no, well, I didn't want to cut you off, but no, I did want to, thank you. The program team has done such a wonderful job. This is a commonly asked for topic, and I feel like I've been drinking through a fire hose, but I've gotten a lot out of it. And I didn't mean to cut you off, Michelle. Did you have other things to add?
No, not at all. Go ahead. Nancy's one of our co-presidents.
Yes,
Tracey.
I'm Nancy Keene. I'm one of the co-presidents. I did want to mention, Allison just put the note in the chat box. Impact 100 Westchester, their grant cycle has kicked off, and for next year. And Joanne Stewart, our board member, generously donates her time to give 2 information sessions on how to do their LOI. They're December 4th and December 16th, and you can email Joanne if you want to sign up and have any questions. And I can't believe Thanksgiving is next week, but everyone have a happy and healthy Thanksgiving and holiday.
Yeah, and I just want to add thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. I think Michelle had initially reached out to Julie Assel, and she had called me and said, I have to be at this luncheon. Can you do this presentation? And I've been working with Michelle, and it was just a pleasure presenting to you guys. So thank you for the opportunity.
We appreciate you pivoting quickly and picking up and doing this for us. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
And thank you for
happy
being
to.
responsive to our interests. So I hope this has been helpful to all. All right.
Now go out there and get some federal funding. There's lots coming down. There is.
All right.
Thank you so
many
much.
thanks. Yeah.
Have a great day,
Yeah.
everybody.
You too,
Thanks,
Tracy.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Tracy.
Yeah,
you so
thank
much.
you. It was great being here. I'm trying to find how to hang up. Thank you for the opportunity to do this, guys. I'm so glad you reached out. And Michelle and I, we've talked, maybe we'll talk going forward and see if there's ways to collaborate. I love what you guys are doing with your chapter. So once a month, you guys is it once a month you just connect and it's an open hour?
The connections calls are every other month
other.
for an open hour.
Mm-hmm. And do you have it like a designated facilitator of the calls?
Not really.
Bring
Allison, you do.
what's on your mind, and
Yeah.
we put our heads together.
That's wonderful.
It's very collegial. We don't view each other as competitors. We all try to help each other.
Mm-hmm.
John is a newer member. We try to mentor people. We make suggestions. We link people to resources. Oh, you're working on that. You should talk to so-and-so. Or
Yep.
so there's no set agenda, but there's always robust conversation.
It's a great resource for someone who's only been doing this for a few years. It's amazing. So I just think about adding that, Tracy, to your chapter.
Yeah, we actually have a chapter meeting this afternoon, so I thought about mentioning it to them. And of course, I'm rolling off. Well, I guess anybody can do it because, of course, I'm rolling off the program committee. So here you guys go. But yeah, that's great.
It's really easy. I mean, it's setting up a
Yeah.
Zoom, and whoever phones in, whoever gets on, gets on.
Mm-hmm. So no one has to. Yeah.
No one has to really run it other than
Sure.
get out the Zoom link, which I managed to mess up today. But
And Allison's really good. Like sometimes she'll run it at 8 a.m., sometimes at 9 a.m. This one coming up is at 9:30.
we switch
Sometimes
off.
they're a lunchtime thing, and we just kind of see, so that we're flexible. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because some people can never do that 8 a.m. and some people can never do the noon or whatever, and so
Sure.
it's nice to get a different crowd at different times. So yeah, I think you do a great job of that, Allison, and I love those conversations.
Great.
So
All
we really
right.
appreciate it, Tracy. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. And we, maybe we'll be in touch, and maybe we can pick some
Sure.
of your brains for your program ideas and back and forth. But it's nice to make the connection.
Yes. Wonderful. Have a great rest of your Thursday, everybody.
All right, you too. All right, I'm going to end it. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.